Thank you very much indeed. Because this is a network of people who have expertise and interest in the liturgical and worshipping life of Christian communities, I thought it might be helpful to let this broad map of some of the questions, some of the thinking, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges to land by wondering together, and people in this space will have more direct experience of this than I have. I've been out of now parochial ministry for nearly 20 years. I mean, I encounter congregations in different shapes or form. That ecology of life of Windsor Castle did, of course, include older adults, some very interesting older adults too. But I want primarily to reflect on 10, 11 years work in the Foundation Lady Catherine Leveson, and the work that we did in relation to equipping churches to think about the nature of worship with older adults. And there are some resources from that time which the steering group have, which I hope will be made available. So those of you familiar with, I hope this raises half a smile amongst you, those of you familiar with the design function on PowerPoint offered me an alternative cover image for worship, and this is it. I'm told it's worship. It's not worship as I know it, but you know, I am nearly dead. But there we are. Just let it run a little bit. It does create a ridiculously large file. But worship has changed and will change. But the question I want to ask us in this session is worship with older people. Is it with or for or and? And I suppose I do sensibly want to understand the complexity. I'll just get rid of that because it's driving me crazy or crazier. Hang on, if I can do that. Next slide, that would be it. That would be sensible. I do want to acknowledge that although some of you will be involved in specific acts of worship with and for older people, particularly perhaps in care homes, that of course, within the context of building community and building a diverse, serving, worshipping community, then we need to know that God is the God of all ages, not just old age, and that healthy churches often become healthier as they become intergenerational. And a book that has been very influential on some of my thinking, particularly with the work of formation here in the Sarum Centre for Formation in Ministry, is a book by Andrew Root, who seems to be able to write a book every year. He's quite a kind of collection of books on my shelf at the moment. But I think his best book is called The Relational Pastor. And what Andrew Root argues in this book in terms of the nurture of worshipping communities is that we need to cease being functional, or we need to be aware of the dangers of functionalism, worship as light entertainment, worship as focused only on drawing some groups in at the expense of others. And if we have the resources to do so, to nurture worshipping communities that are attractive across the generations by the quality of relationality, of nurturing friendship, spiritual friendships in community for a particular place. It emerges out of work he'd done really with competing churches in a couple of large cities in America. But his theology of relationality, I think, is very powerful within this context. So what I want to do is to show you a bit of my own experience, perhaps to remind you what you are already very familiar with, and that is some of the practicalities and context. I do want to share with you what older people over these years of my engagement with this subject area have told us, me, and what they value. I want to say a little bit about the homily, if you don't mind, if you bear with that, reflect a little bit on my own learning, and perhaps this old Westcott House student might be able to do some theology, but you'll be the judge of that when you do the feedback forms. And then, of course, your questions will be very important. Well, the research demonstrated that some churches simply do not think about, though you may be a group that disproves this rule or this assertion, but they do not think about what it might mean to involve older people in their offer of worship. This came from a time where I think there was more stability in this particular part of the West Midlands, across some care homes, but also some churches who had midweek services designed especially for older people. And we're talking about a picture built up over 4 or 5 years with several thousand people interviewed in terms of their stories. And it won't surprise you, and I get the prize for stating the obvious perhaps, is that older people, both those who had been well nurtured in the Christian story and in the Christian faith, and those who had simply turned up to the service because someone had brought them, or that they were interested, or that they thought it was worth going to for the cake and the tea afterwards. But almost without exception, though they're not uncritical, as you will see, said it is very, very important. There are questions about timing. There are questions about the length of the service and how much people can concentrate or attend to. But overall, many of these women and men said this is the event of the week for me. There was a strong expressed sense that sometimes vicars are not good doing things with the congregation, that they sometimes, I'm choosing myself very carefully, breathed in to do it for them. And people sussed out quite quickly where on the spectrum, as it were, of presence, time, attention, engagement, the spiritual life of the person leading the service or celebrating the Holy Communion, how important it was. And there were some older people, much to my surprise, who were very, very articulate about the gap they perceived between what the priest, women or men, said and whether or not it felt as if they meant what they said. Now, I'm not a liturgical expert, as you all know, but it rather bothered me, and it came out in all kinds of different ways. He didn't look as if he wanted to be here, was one comment. he didn't seem able to be awake enough to read the sentences properly was a devastating comment. Um, uh, um, and there were a number of comments about, oh, I felt sorry for the vicar because he clearly was in a hurry and it was a bit late, and all of that. And I should just say this is primarily in Anglican churches, so there's some it needs to be read through those lens. But there were a significant number of people, to get back to my own mum's kind of metaphor of stairs and landing, who picked up the dissonance. All of us have got to varying degrees and levels between what was expressed and what people saw the president of the Eucharist or the leader of worship embodying in themselves. Just to shift into a bit more positivity, many of the older people felt valued and heard and listened to, particularly in those acts of worship where there was a level of participation. They felt that this was important, and really a very powerful expression of wanting to engage with something that was important. And there was an ordinariness of the gracefulness within which that was kind of expressed in relation to this bit of listening. So let's look at practicalities and context. Now, not all of the services that we looked at as we explored the shape and form of what was being offered, both in shorter midweek services, occasionally at 8 o'clock services, but particularly in care homes, were communion services, as I'd said. But it was clear from older adults that they were not always at the center of the decision making about time and place. Now, that's an easy thing for me to be sat here in the shadow of Salisbury Cathedral, naming that. I know that being a church leader, being a leader is a lay or ordained leader is ever more difficult. This isn't about being clever or deconstructive about the role of a clergy person. It is to acknowledge the complexity of the role, and it's much more complex now than I think it was these years ago. But I do think it was worth expressing this in this particular context. At whose convenience do we choose the time and the place would be the question. This is more difficult, particularly when we're talking about older adults in fourth age. 25 minutes is about the maximum that some older adults, particularly in fourth age, can really sit with for any extended period of time. I mean, that's kind of quite profound liturgical and organizational questions. I do think it is possible, and I have a copy to hand, to have a Eucharist within, and a homily, hasten to add, within 25 minutes. But it does require some measure of focus and some measure of liturgical curating as well. Music is important. Readings and intercessions were also important, and of course enabled participation. This is all very obvious stuff to you. I edited a book called Services for Weekdays, which had 52 through the whole cycle of the church's year, to model what it would look like to choose a simple Bible reading within the season of the church's year, some pointers for reflection and conversation, with some prayers and other suggestions. I know it's probably not, you're probably able to get it for 5 pence on Amazon or something somewhere, but I enjoyed doing it. So the other thing, now this may well represent the kind of demography of the people that we surveyed, but I love this kind of sense of the other bit of the feedback is we want structure and habit. We don't want too much anarchy. Now that's I think inevitably part of part of uh, the uh, the faith stage that some of these people were at. I don't know if this research was conducted again, whether how different it would be. I think there would be some synergy and connections there. So then let's look at what is valued. I mean, I think I hope I'm not patronizing anyone here, but I mean, these are very obvious, but they are the voices of older people, which is why I thought it was helpful at this stage to look at. They may not resonate with your experience. I'd be very glad to find out about that. There was a real excitement about listening and learning more about faith, the faith, and especially some of those questions we've seen perhaps earlier, pre and post power cut, about that old age pose. And a simple invitation question related, connected to the Bible reading into the space, often generated some very profound and moving wisdom. I value participating. Always interesting to know what people mean when they say participating. I'm not sure about worship as fun. Fun is not really my vocabulary when it comes to worship. That's my problem, not theirs. But here's another thing. This is a generation, and I think they're still with us, who have been very faithful to the church and who had a deep sense of their faithfulness through the decades. There was an eagerness to sing, usually very badly, but that didn't matter. And also good focused periods of silence for prayer, both silent and loud. So as I think I suggested with the services for weekdays, you develop a much more kind of coherent and engaged, logically articulate resource. But a short scripture reading, which prompts, and this is very standard stuff, which you're all much better at doing than I am, a question or the sharing of an experience or a visual aid. It allowed people to participate by thinking and feeling aloud. But it does take time to build up trust. And I think that is more challenging given the changes of resources in and around parishes and deaneries and areas and churches. So what did I learn from that period of time? What do I continue to learn? I occasionally dip into this work in this diocese and other dioceses. I think it is astonishing, given the format I've described. There may be other or better formats. I look forward to hearing about those. How the shy, the inarticulate, and the very modest can find their voice. How do we allow people to sing and share and articulate their faith? So that, I mean, this then developed into a major piece of writing called Valuing Age at Temple Borsal, but there was a faith development. This was about growing faith younger and older together. But there was some faith development over a long period of time that happened. And the third point on that side is very obvious. It did allow those leading worship, and I was not the only person leading worship within this particular context. We had a couple of other retired clergy and lay people who would lead worship or extended communion. I don't know if that's an illegal service anymore. Well, I don't really care at that point. That was by the by. But it asking people, inviting people into a conversation does kind of lead you into all kinds of interesting and challenging geography about what kind of God they believe in, and so on and so forth. And there are people who are simply amazed, I think, by what is said, for good or ill. I remember one woman who'd been a Salvation Army officer and worked in some very tough parts of the country, very faithful at worship. The thing that she really loved doing was taking the collection. But as I began the shortened but legal Eucharistic prayer, she stood up and said, "This is cannibalism. This is just cannibalism." I think she was suffering from memory change, but it clearly took her back to a particular bit of nurture of her faith in Ireland, a Protestant faith in Ireland, where there was a good deal of teaching about what the Mass, what the Eucharist was about. It then led into quite a long conversation, which was complicated. She'd no recollection of having said it, of course, the day after. But it is a reminder that what we are shown and what is shared with us sometimes goes quite deep, both helpfully and unhelpfully. So two more slides. I'm sorry if this sounds very obvious, but I'm very energized by taking me back into this particular period of ministry, as we teach a little bit of it here. It's important, of course, for many of these people about family, in particular family who have gone before them and are seen no longer. And there are positive and negative and complex kind of elements to the family experience. Very often people don't have an opportunity in the nurture of their faith at whatever age to explore how key events in their life and history have shaped who they are and how they believe and what they want to pray for. There was often a lack of any abstract or general reflection. I think it taught me that people take a good deal more on trust than one might allow for or understand. And also, I think it proved and showed, if those are the right adjectives to me, that there is a deep ambivalence in English cultural and social and spiritual life of talking about God. I put it there, lack of God dimension for its own sake. I think people were very uninterested often in theological or biblical stuff. Now, there's a paradox here, because what I'm not saying is that these people were not faithful or were not faithful disciples, that their faith wasn't real or deep, but sometimes we make assumptions about what's important when we are engaged in worship with some people, that could be challenged if we stopped and explored where people are. I don't know whether congregations engage in this kind of reflexivity, but there were some we make too many assumptions about what's going on in the shape of worship. And the other thing, which won't surprise you, because it's in all of us, is that there is some terrible prejudice that emerges quite close to the surface. So let me end by saying that, saying the obvious perhaps, that much of this intentional liturgical worshipping nurturing work depends on time and trust. And for that to happen, as I think made clear in earlier comments and reflections, is very countercultural in today's busy and hyperactive and functional church. But that people are open and ready to take part. Forgive the typographical error there. And we might want to talk about this. Today's older generation are probably the last generation to have a direct or residual sense of worship. I think some interesting questions here about spiritual nurture. It requires effort and cultivation and care. These are all needed for those who are unfamiliar with the church. And this kind of work is taking place in many different shapes and forms with small groups. And it does require, I think, a certain stability of connection and relationship and friendship and involvement of the staff and others. So slightly different tack from this morning's presentation, but I hope there might be some resonances there that are of interest or healthy and helpful irritation.
James, thank you very much